We'd like to welcome you to our class today, our 3:30 class presented by James Tanner, Moving from the Tidewater, the Westward Migration in the British Colonies. And we'd like to thank him sincerely for the time he takes to present these classes and all of the hours that he spends behind the scenes preparing them and helping people with research. He is a remarkable family history expert, and we appreciate him being part of our group at the BYU Family History Library. And I'll now turn the time over to him for sharing of his screen.
One thing I would want to mention is that, just to clarify, that the BYU Family History Library is on the academic calendar. That means that we follow the schedule of the students at the university. And so that's why there's breaks, because like Christmas break and spring break and things like that, every time there's a holiday, and other times when the library is closed is when we're not working. So that just explains. If you want to know in depth, you can look for the BYU academic calendar and you'll see all of the closures for the university, and we're included, of course, with the library. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit of history and a lot of resources. And basically, this is a topic that has kind of resurfaced, I would say, dozens, hundreds, perhaps times. At one point in time, I had a string for almost, it seems like for a long time, almost a year probably, where it seemed like every person was asking me about ancestors in North Carolina. And so it's just been interesting over the time that this is one of the big challenges of genealogical research, is the immigrant who comes from Europe, primarily in this time period from England, to the colonies in the United States. And they appear here, and then they seem to magically just sort of appear, and there's almost no records documenting where they came from. But what we're going to examine here is in depth on those that came in to the colonies that established on what we called the Tidewater, and then migrated from the Tidewater into the interior, primarily into Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and other states. And you can remember that Pennsylvania does not have a shoreline with the Pacific. It has a bay into the Schuylkill River, but it doesn't have a main access other than the waterway. And so all the other coastal countries are considered to be Tidewater countries. So let's kind of talk about that and get some ideas of what we're talking about. Now, to give you some time frame here, English colonial settlement of the American continent started on the seacoast in Massachusetts in 1602. Okay, so a lot of you maybe can pull out of your head Jamestown, Virginia in 1605, and Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620, and perhaps some other dates, the dates for Georgia or whatever. But this is the earliest real official settlement, but it only lasted a few months or a few weeks probably because of the weather. It was on Cuttyhunk Island, just off the coast of Massachusetts. And that's actually a picture of it. And this is where the first initial contact with the English occurred. When they were exploring all of the East Coast, they realized, like they could with the Hudson River and all of the other rivers that flow into the Atlantic Ocean, that they could sail their boats up the rivers. Most of the larger rivers became access points into the interior of the American continent. But as is shown by this picture on the Potomac, of the Great Falls Potomac, once they got to what was called the edge of the Tidewater, which means that there was no longer any influence from the ocean, then they were in serious trouble because there was no way up for boats. And if you wanted to get any further, you had to get out and walk. Occasionally, they would bring horses over it, but they weren't on most of these boats. So it was a lot of walking if you wanted to go anywhere. But the English colonists explored all along the coast, and most of the settlements and larger cities that we see on the eastern coast of the United States now are built in the Tidewater on rivers that initially gave them access to the interior. So that's kind of one explanation of where everybody was living and how they were living there. But the other important dates, and when I mention this, for example, this is the Virginia Company, and it was a trading company, and it was chartered by King James I on 10 April 1606. And the whole idea of it was to colonize the eastern coast of America. So the process here was that the King of England claimed sovereignty over the territory of the United States, where the United States is now, the North America. And with the exception of Florida, which was previously claimed by Spain, and the interior of the United States, which was claimed by Spain, and other parts of the country claimed by France, and a little bit on the West Coast claimed by Russia, there was really no exact understanding of where any of this property was. It was just a vast amount of land. But because the sovereign now owned that land, the sovereign could give, in essence, permission in the form of trading companies or land development companies to various of their individuals. So they would give a land grant to part of the nobility, and they would then technically own this large tract of land that really nobody knew where it was or how big it was or what it was. And so this was back starting in 1606. And if we look at the extent of that, this is the charter of the London Company that was permitted to establish the colony and the Virginia colony. It was 100 miles square between that 34 degrees and 40 degrees north, between Cape Fear, Long Island Sound, and it just extended back indefinitely. In other words, the main grant was along the seacoast. And if you look at this carefully, you'll see that it took in all of the areas that we now just barely south of what would become New York, and then extended clear up into Canada and across the United States. There was no real substantial western boundary. At the time, there was only kind of vague understanding that of the existence of the Mississippi River. It was being used eventually by the French for trade and to establish the French colonies in North America. That's a different story, but basically, between Britain and France, if they were in the middle of a war, and Britain prevailed and ended up with the French colonies, but the French still claimed the colonies. And then after the United States was formed, the part of the country claimed by France was purchased under the Louisiana Purchase, when they purchased access to the Mississippi River and the Mississippi River watershed, in a sense. So that was the main expansion of the United States after 1776. But we're talking 100 years, more than 100 years earlier, when there was no knowledge or anything about this part of the country. Now, what we're talking about is in 1607, 104 Englishmen and boys arrived in North America, and they started a settlement, and they picked the site of Jamestown, Virginia, for their settlement, which was named after King James I, obviously. And so Jamestown is what most history books will say is the original English colony, English settlement in North America. Notwithstanding the fact that fishermen and others had been there for many years, and perhaps other explorers earlier. There's a lot of different theories and conjectures about that. And there's some actual contact down the coast of Canada from the Vikings and other countries in Europe. But basically, the establishment of Jamestown was quite difficult. And if you look here apparently I've got it covered up. Well, this is a map showing you where, what part of the island of it was Jamestown. Part of the idea of having the colony on an island was the defensibility of the island. We need to always remember that the land here was not just open and free. It was very much populated by large Indian tribes that lived, American natives who lived all along the coast. And there, we'll talk about in just shortly a series of wars that occurred, but beginning with the King Philip's War. And there's this Jamestown. To give you some orientation here, there's Williamsburg just to the north. And if we keep clicking here, we'll see a little bit further out, you can see where this is from the York River and the James River. And it's just a narrow part of land, and it's got a lot of streams, and some of them are navigable, and there's ways to get in and around, and that's why these cities were developed in this part of the country. And then we can see, if we go out really much further, you can see where this is in respect to Williamsburg and Richmond and Newport and all of the other places along the coast. So as you look at this, you'll see the Chesapeake Bay coming in. You'll see the other big rivers, the James and other big rivers that come into, that opened up the land. But there was, as I've mentioned at the beginning, a limit, and that's when the topography of the land got so steep that there were waterfalls and rapids. And those were the ones that basically stopped the progress up and concentrated the settlement along the coast of the country. Here's another view of it showing Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown. And this is one of the original maps. So this was what they understood what was happening with this. And this was about what they knew about the country at the time of the Revolutionary War. And so this is kind of the way that the people understood how the country was formed. In 1630, now we go up a little further north, and you'll see that the Massachusetts Bay colonists began to push up the Connecticut River Valley. And that was why you find a lot of people established in Connecticut and Rhode Island. There's political reasons and religious reasons why that occurred, but most of it was population. And as more and more settlers came, millions of people came over the next 100 years to America from Europe, not just English, but all Germans and French and a lot of other countries came to America. And of course, people who wanted land found that the best land had already been appropriated. And so they would go past the first land owners and get new land and so forth. And that would continue and as all the time. So now if you're thinking about this, let's orient this to the situation, to what's happening for records for genealogical purposes. The first settlers that come to Jamestown and to Plymouth and to the other colonies that began to be settled have been identified. Okay, let's kind of take that as the thought in our mind. From the earliest time of 1600 until about 1650 or 1660, it's pretty much a matter of looking at the existing research that has already been done, extensive research that documents nearly everybody that lived in that area. And the main way that that's done and the way they're identified is through all of the town records which were kept and all of the land records that were kept. And then as people died, the probate records and the transfers of land records and all of the other information. And then the churches that were being established at the time that the people came, and those who came and went to places where they could get religious liberty, like Rhode Island, and the original ones in Massachusetts who didn't want anybody else there of other religions for a long time. But basically that movement created records. And those records are, I'm not going to say very much complete, because because there's some other very important factors that I'll bring out in just a minute concerning indentured servants and enslaved people. But between 1675 and 1678, it came kind of to a head that the Native American population decided that they'd had enough, and they began a series of Indian wars that had continued until actually the last Indian war was in like 1921. Of course, it was a losing battle all along, except for the ones who managed to negotiate treaties and end up with what they had left. It was certainly a tragic and tremendously unfair to the Native American situation, but that's basically what happened. So in 1675 to 78, King's Philip's War wiped out Deerfield and Northfield in Massachusetts, Suffield and Simsbury in Connecticut. Now you have another layer of records, and those are the military records. And what happened in America is been carried up to the problems with the current day is they formed militias, individual armed forces to defend the towns, primarily from the Indians, and later, of course, participated heavily in the Revolutionary War. But the militias also kept records, and there are abundant records of the King Philip's War and all of the conscripts and the people that served in that war. And so it begins to see that as history developed along the coast, more and more records were created. And so, for example, here's King Philip's War and the records from Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and the Indians, and the history of that, and where those records could be found. And this is in the Family Search Research Wiki. If you dig into U.S. military and the colonial wars from 1607 to 1763, you'll find that there's quite a bit of information about each of the wars with a lot of records. And they are not primarily gathered into one particular website or one particular place. They're sort of scattered all over, and military records are extremely useful, but they're extremely diverse, and in some cases you have to go to the place where they're being kept to see them, because not all of them are digitized. More and more are being digitized and are available, and the searches online will certainly be helpful, but that's only one part of all of the records that were being kept at that time. So here's another great factor into understanding where the records might be, how they were kept, and what the situation was with the people that were living there. You can, if you look at this sort of generally, this map sort of generally, you'll see that there was the red line there is called the Great Wagon Road, which was first, it's a map from 1751. So we're jumping ahead almost 100 years. So the first 100 years of settlement was totally along the coast. And it was only after the pressures from the 1700s that they began to move further and further inland. And what does this mean for genealogical purposes? What it means is it's a very good illustration of the situation here. So you'll notice that this Great Wagon Road was the primary settlement road. So if your ancestors came to this part of Virginia, down by Jamestown and further up the coast, up the rivers, then what would happen is that they would basically follow the rivers. And if you look on this map, you'll see each of the rivers looks like they have like hair growing on them, but those are really names of all the little establishments and cities and towns that were being established along the rivers as settlement went up the rivers. Now, if you think about this for just a few minutes, you should realize that travel was basically up the rivers from east to west, or east to northwest, slightly northwest, because of the way the land was slanted down towards the ocean. But there was very little ability to travel north and south. And if you, in this time period into the middle of the 1700s, if you start finding what you think is evidence of a family having moved, say, from any further than, let's say, from Massachusetts to Rhode Island, because they're next door to each other and had overlapping claims, that's not going to happen. So most of the land, most of the movement would be west or slightly north, but it would not be north and south. And so that's kind of a rule that you need to kind of think in the back of your mind, that if you find names of places and additional things you're not going to find at this time period are movements north and south through the colonies to a great extent. There was more movement back and forth to England than there was between the colonies north and south. And that's why there was so much of a distinctive culture and difference between the counties, the different states as they evolved in the United States, simply because they're regionally determined by the people who came at those different periods of time. Now, an additional road, as the development came down on the other side of the mountains. So what happens is there's the Shenandoah Valley that runs north and northwest to southwest, northeast to southwest across this part of the country on the west side of the Appalachian Mountains. And if you were to start out up in Pennsylvania and in that area, then this was the Great Valley Road, and this was the way that you could get down through the country on the west side of the mountains and eventually get into Tennessee and Kentucky area of the country. So you may have people, for example, who are from Pennsylvania who end up down in the middle part of the country and down there in what ends up being Tennessee, because there was a road to travel and that was a possibility. The same thing as you'll see the road that cuts off of the main Great Valley Road and goes down on that side of the mountains in another valley that takes them to Augusta and into Georgia. So what you have here is a diagram of over the time frame of when these things occurred that shows the two major ways that people could be moving. They could be moving away from the coast up towards the Tidewater, the edge of the Tidewater, or they could have been coming down from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, down through the western part of what's now Virginia, down to Tennessee, North Carolina, and South Carolina, and then eventually into Georgia. And that's the path that comes. As you track people across the South and into the eastern part of the United States, you're going to see people go from Texas, for example. They will end up in Texas. So as you trace the families back in time, you'll find them in Mississippi, Alabama, and then Georgia, and then up through South Carolina, North Carolina, and eventually you may connect into Virginia. And it's very possible that you would fix and connect into Philadelphia. But what you need to remember is that the people that you're looking for were on the west side of the mountains and not on the east side of the mountains. And so there's not much traffic across the mountains until later, when they began to push through the passes, like the big gaps in the mountains where they could find a way to walk through to the western part of Virginia, which is now called Kentucky. So from 1803 onward, there was some things that happened in Congress that created some important problems. And these are some important dates for you to remember, because this is not something that people have in their heads, but this is something that's tremendously important in determining what happens once these early settlers began to go across the country. So first of all, the date is important to remember is 1792 Kentucky statehood. Many times what you will find in genealogical research is that somebody will have recorded that these people were born in Kentucky. Remember the 1792 Kentucky statehood, because they weren't born in Kentucky. If they were born before 1792, they were born in Virginia. And if they were born in Virginia and you thought they were born in one of the places in Kentucky, you have to remember that not too many years before that date, there weren't any people in Kentucky. There were, well, except for the indigenous population, there were French or a few people wandering around. There weren't anybody. And so there were no people there. And so basically, if you're looking in Kentucky, you're going to be plumbing a dry well, as they say. The next one is 1796, and that's Tennessee statehood for exactly the same reason that you'll see that. People say they were born in Kentucky. It usually means that they were born in the far western part of Virginia and not or Tennessee, and not in other words, North Carolina and Tennessee and Virginia and Kentucky. And also remember that the date of 1803 was when Ohio became a state. So previous to that, anybody who settled in Ohio was settling someplace else, Ohio Territory. Pennsylvania is the interesting example because by 1830, most all of the counties in Pennsylvania were well established by 1830. And so any new population had to cross the Ohio River and go into what was then Ohio, or down the Ohio River to settle on in other places. And then remember the other big catch, and that is that West Virginia did not exist until 1863 during the Civil War, when the West Virginia people decided they didn't want to be part of the South and broke off from the state of Virginia and were recognized as a state by the Union. So any dates before 1863 that say that the people lived in West Virginia are actually living in Virginia. And if you think about it, that's what determines where you're going to find the records for all of these places. Another thing you're going to need to remember is the date when the counties were created to find the records. Now, the records we're going to be looking for are land and property records, probate records, marriage records, primarily church records when they're established, but because they come along and get established about the time all of the settlers arrive in a certain location. And then there's going to be other kinds of records that are generated by the court records and other records that are generated by the people as they start forming towns and creating communities. And so all of these records, business records and business transactions and tax records, there's just a long list of these kinds of records that are generated as these people move west and settle. So you always need to be aware of the date when the counties were created to find the records. And this is the situation that would occur. Let's give you an example of starting on the East Coast. And there's a new county because they form a county just like they did in England. They had counties. And so they created counties where they had the court systems and the law enforcement systems and began all of those things that go along with county creation. And as each of the counties were created, then there was a series of records. So the first county kept records, and then there was a second county created. So we have the old county and the new county. So the new county guy in charge of the records, whoever it is, the recorder or whoever is put in charge of records, goes to the old county and says, well, what about the records? And the old county guy says, well, what about the records? And the new guy says, well, don't I get the records? And they say, no, there are records. You can't have them. You make your own new records. Okay. So that means that the county formation determines that the records are in the old county and not in the new county. So if you start looking for records back to the formation of the county date, you have to know what county, one of the counties that it was formed from, that's where the records might be. Okay, then here's the next scenario. You got the old guy and the new guy. The new guy comes and says, what about the records? And the old guy says, well, I don't want them. Here, you can have them all. So all the records move to the new county, the old records as well as the new county. So when you go to the old county, the old records are not there. They're in some other county that was created after the new county. That's that situation. Now, you might think, well, that's strange, but just to mention one state, Pennsylvania, we've seen records start with Burke County on the eastern part of Pennsylvania and move all the way across the state to Washington County on the Ohio River. So looking for records, and somebody says, well, I searched in the county and didn't find them because their county records didn't exist. Well, the reason they didn't exist is because they were in the previous county, or they had moved to a new county and they're someplace between the new county and the edge of the state or wherever they ended up. And so it's not a matter of looking at one county and deciding that you don't know where the records are, because there's a series of things that happen. Okay, so the next level was the Piedmont, and the Piedmont stretched from the fall line of the Tidewater to the edge of the mountains. And this land was the next land that was settled all across the country. Now, you remember that there's people coming down the Shenandoah Valley up into Pennsylvania, and there's also people coming up all along the seacoast. But to get into the next level into the mountains, and by the time some of the waves of settlers came in the 1800s, all of this land had been appropriated and for all practical purposes. And so they went into the mountains. And some of them crossed the mountains and went into the even further west until, of course, they got to California. So here was the road, what you would think to be one of the first penetrating roads. And as you get this history, you need to look carefully at the dates, because it's very easy for somebody to slip back into 1700s and starts getting really, really basically complicated. Now, here's another thing that you just might get off of this map that's interesting. If you look here, you'll see Madison as a state, Greensburg is the name of a place, Mount Pleasant is the name of a place, Scottdale or Scottsdale, you'll see Uniontown. Any of those towns sound familiar as places where you might have had Farmington, for example? Ever heard of any of those other places? You have another very basic fact is that they brought all of these names, or almost all of these names, from England, and except the ones that were kind of made up names, or the names after people. But these town names are very common all the way across the country, and you get pretty confused if you start looking up a town that in this time period and think all of a sudden you're in a different state or a different county. So there was nothing that prevented people from naming the same place over and over and over again, which obviously happened in the United States. So now the people coming down the wagon road came down and hit the other side of the mountains, and they were all sorts of people, Irish, Scots, Germans, along the Great Wagon Road. And you can see here by the arrows coming up from Charleston and Wilmington and New Bern and all these different places, that they were kind of running into each other. And the Scot people, the Irish Scots, were kind of the predominant ones, but they weren't predominant in the sense of having the entire culture. So what happens is we have the Appalachian mountain culture that gives us a lot of our music and a lot of other things that comes out of these mountains. And it's basically these people that came at the time period when there was not enough land to appropriate, and they had to travel back up into the mountains to get land that they could own. So this is another example of Pennsylvania Dutch, and they say the word Dutch, but Dutch is just a misinterpretation of the word Deutsch, which is the German. These are German settlers, and they were not just in Pennsylvania. They were clear down into what's known as now as Kentucky and Tennessee. So they're following the lines. It's extremely important that you understand these movements, because otherwise you're just going to get them lost. And the Scotch Irish, who have quite a reputation up in the mountains. But in spite of this, it was there were a lot of these other people. There were Germans, and I've said this, French, Huguenots, and Eastern Europeans of all kinds. And so there's quite a mixture of people who were coming here. Now, who was keeping a record of all these people? There was somebody standing on the shore of the United States and they would take down everybody's name? Well, we get that impression when we think of Castle Garden and of the other, like Ellis Island and things like that. We think, well, everybody was just writing it all down. The answer is absolutely not. The first immigration laws in the United States did not occur until 1882, and that was on the West Coast in the Chinese Exclusion Act, and has nothing to do with this. Anybody who came to America back in those time periods just got off the boat, walked in, and started living here. And there was nobody to control it. There was nobody to record it. And if they changed their name, or if they were having some other difficulties and didn't want anybody to know who they were, there was no way they could do. Now, this is a graphic example of just one of the colonies. This is Virginia Colony from 1634 to 1900. And look at the blue county down there. And this is an animation, and it'll show you as it walks through the formation of the counties. This comes from the Atlas of Historical County Boundaries from the Newberry Library. And if you look up Atlas of Historical County Boundaries, you'll get a detailed historical, every single change recorded history of every single county in the United States. So if you need any kind of reference to when or where a county was created or what the boundaries were and the legal basis for it, it's all recorded right there in the Atlas of Historical County Boundaries. So let's start this little animation, and you can see as the counties are created, they're created along the rivers. They're long, skinny counties. And then when we get down into the late 1700s, then we get this part of Virginia that's known as Kentucky. Now, Virginia all of a sudden claimed everything up to Canada. That didn't last very long. But now we've got all of the country, and Kentucky has come off as a state, and we're into the 1800s. And finally, in the 1800s, West Virginia becomes a different country. But you can see how they divide and divide as more and more people came in. And this is keeping track of this is fairly complicated, and understanding where they are. Now, there went West Virginia, and now we have some dots appearing, and the dots are independent county cities. They're cities that have their own jurisdiction and their own set of records. Okay, well, that's the boundary changes. Now, what are the lessons that we learn from these boundary changes? What we learn is the record keeping moves with the boundaries. So what's the other possibility? We have the new county and the old county, and in one case, the record stayed with the old county, and the other ones, they went to the new county. Well, what about the situation if the new county comes and says, what about the records? The old county says, well, what about the records? And they said, you have to take them. No, I don't want them. Well, the new county doesn't want them. The old county doesn't want them. They say, okay, fine, let's send them to the state. So they box everything up and they send it to the state. Yep. And they could be in the state archives, completely separate, different than keeping them in the county. And they may not even be organized very well, because they may have just been shipped in some containers. And they could still be in the same containers, by the way, that they were when they were shipped. So there's possibilities, all sorts of possibilities about where these records might have been. And if your people moved, their records are going to be in a new county. So as they move from wherever they were living before, and they move into a different county, even a different area, then that area may become a county, and that their records may all of a sudden be in that new county. Just understanding that the people moved, the records followed the people, but the counties were created with a time lag after the people may have gotten there. If your people did not move, their record still might be in a new county because they could have been formed, the county could have been split, and they could be now in a new county that wasn't even in the old county. You can see that here in Utah, you can see that in Arizona, and they're very simple out here because there aren't a lot of counties compared to places in the East. But it's the same process, and the records could be in a completely new county and after the date of the formation of the new county. So knowing when the counties are created is tremendously important for understanding where the records can be located. So you need to focus on land and property records and probate records, and also the historical context. And then last, the people moving west were primarily trying to acquire property and avoid the government. And don't be surprised if they disappear. Primarily, I think where I've kind of hit the proverbial obstruction called the brick wall is when the Scots-Irish got to America and marched west up into the mountains and then simply never allowed anybody to come up there. And they're simply not on the census records. They're just not there. And you can see where they were living and how they moved west, and then they disappear. And they disappear because nobody wanted to go up in the mountains and count them. And that was just the reality of how that worked. Okay, so once again, I'm going to emphasize the first immigration laws were passed in 1882. And the first restrictive immigration laws were passed in 1917. There just weren't any laws. People keep saying, well, you should be able to find these people when they came to America. And the answer is no, you shouldn't be able to find people. There was nobody keeping track of them. So sometimes you could find them leaving England or leaving Germany or leaving France or Switzerland or wherever they came from. But there was nobody keeping track of them coming to America. And so really, at a lot of times, that's going to be a problem. And another one that I mentioned is convict servants in the American colonies. There were at least 60,000 convicts that were shipped from England to America and sold as indentured servants as the colonies. Just think about that. If you were picked up in England and shipped to America against your will because you were a convict and you were sold as an indentured servant and had an obligation to work for a period of years, what do you think you're going to think about what happened to you in England? And that was one of the major factors of the people who were willing to throw off the domination of Great Britain in the American colonies. And understanding this process with the indentured servants is extremely important from the standpoint of genealogy, because if your ancestor turned out to be one of these 60,000 convicts, then you are probably going to have a real difficult time finding anything about that person. It was very easy when somebody came to America on an indentured servant contract and simply changed their name and then didn't tell people where they came from. Because maybe they didn't want somebody to know that they were a criminal. So think about it. And this is another factor. These are things that if you don't know this stuff, you get really frustrated looking for people. Between 1/2 and 2/3 of the immigrants between the 1630s and the Revolution came under indentures. 75% were under the age of 25. And the adulthood legal age was 24. And those over 24 came on contracts lasting about 3 years. And the question's been raised, are there sources for the indentures? The answer is yes, there are. And primarily, there are very few of them that have been digitized and are available. You'll find some on Family Search, you'll find some on Ancestry. I haven't seen any on Find My Past. There may be a few there too, but the question's never been asked from that end of the records. But yes, you can sometimes find these, but it's sometimes the difficulty. The places where you'll find the records in England are in the poor law records. All of the records of the poor laws in the different parishes and counties, and in some cases, England would hire people to leave. In other words, they'd pay the poor people, they'd pay their way to the United States or to the colonies, to Australia or America or New Zealand or wherever, simply to get rid of them. And the reality of American history is that you may not find the parents of many of these early immigrants. Just the numbers are against you, and the fact that they're not likely to have recorded their parents. One place to look is the local historical and genealogical societies. Like this is an example from one page, the Kentucky Historical Society, with resources and finding aids. So eventually, if you simply do not find anything in Family Search, Ancestry, or whatever, you're going to have to move into these not major source records situations. You need to visit the cemeteries, talk to ministers, visit the local museums, and join the societies. It's just the way you're going to be able to do research is to get to know the people who are there and who are probably related to you if your people actually lived in that area. So tracing them back to someplace in the east or the south is going to create a situation where you eventually, if you really want to get moving back in time, you're going to have to go on the ground and be there and start talking and learning about the local history to the point where you can find these people. Another place is that many of the records end up in library special collections, and that means they're in the sort of restricted areas of the university libraries, primarily, and college libraries. There are about 50 different institutions of higher learning in North Carolina, for example. So you have 50 different special collections libraries that you can go through that may have the records from your county or wherever in North Carolina. Same in South Carolina and the other states equally. Okay, well, that's pretty much the summary of what you do. So tracing the people is only possible if you understand those two great movements, one away from the coast and the other down through the Shenandoah Valley, down to the center part of the country and down into the South. And from that, and learning that that's probably the way they came, then if you're coming backwards through the South, you eventually find the people came either to Georgia or came to as settlers. Now, in each of those states, emphasize this again, and I have talked about this in other webinars, but the documentation on the early colonists is fairly complete, and it's fairly complete for every state. So the earlier you get back, when you get back to original colonists, whether it was in Utah or whether it was in any state across the United States to the East Coast or West Coast, if you're there before even before statehood, before one of the first settlers came in, those first settlers are very well documented people. And it just takes sometimes a tremendous amount of research to determine who they are and where they are. But once you do that, you'll find that the history is there, and it may not be on the big websites, but it's certainly going to be available from the special collections at libraries and the societies and the historical and genealogical societies. Okay, thanks for watching.